I think the book.
In this video, I'm going to explain some of the quirks of coding with Python in Jupyter notebooks. So the key thing to know that you've probably already thought about and seen while we've been coding in class is that Jupyter notebooks are coded in chunks of code in these units called a cell, right? So if I have a chunk of code here, let's say that I define a variable, I just call it x equals 5. This code will execute in unit by unit, right? So I may have a chunk of code here, I hit Shift Enter, it executes that code. I now have a variable underneath the hood stored as x. And now I can refer to that later in all other cells, right? If I just want to see what x is, for instance, I could print it to the screen by typing X and hit Shift Enter. And it spits this out. Notice that the first cell didn't have any output because I was just saving the variable. You have to have some statement to print something to the screen if you want to actually show that to the screen as seen as in this cell. Now, the other thing to note is you have to run the cell in order for it to do anything, right? Just because I said x equals 5 doesn't mean it's actually going to do anything unless I hit Shift Enter first. I need to first execute the cell before that action is taken. So if I have a cell up here, let's say that I define a second variable, y equals 1. And let's add some blank cells down below. If I try to call y later, notice that it says name error, y is not defined. I did not execute this cell. Y equals 1 was not executed, and therefore I can't do anything with y. Perhaps this seems obvious right now after I've explained it, but maybe you've tried something like this in class and have been confused or irritated, and that's why. You need to execute all of the cells before you can actually use them. Now, the other idiosyncrasy about working with Jupyter notebooks that you have to be careful with is you can go back and edit code, and it can get you into a lot of trouble. For instance, what if I go up here and I change x? What if I change x to 2 and I forget that I did that? Let's say that I go do some work down here and I'm doing some operation with x. Well, if I was expecting 10 down here, that's not going to be the case. I redefined x. So you have to be aware of that when you're doing operations. Not only that, you also have to be careful that you can actually break code downstream, right? Let's say that I was doing this operation 2 times x. But up here, I redefine x to not be a number. I redefine it to be a letter, x equals a. Well, now down below, I can no longer do this operation. So code that may have been working previously will not work anymore because I've redefined x. I've done something above to break the code. Oh, and sorry, that I forgot that you can actually do 2 times a letter. So that wasn't the best example. Let's think of an operation where we could actually break our code. Let's say that x is equal to 2, and then I try to take the square root, right? So let's say I do x to the 0.5 power. But then let's say that I redefine x to be a negative number. Well, you can't take the square root of negative numbers. Oh, apparently you can. It gives you an imaginary number. Every example I come up with it kind of fails. Can I think of an example where I could break this code? You can't divide by 0, right? That shouldn't work. Let's try something where I can break this code. Let's say I have x equals 10, and down here I try to do 10 divided by x. Well, now if I set x equal to 0, I have broken my code, right? I've broken code that previously was working just because I've redefined a variable. So it's usually safest if you can. I break this rule all the time, but you should try to avoid modifying code. Ideally, you should write a notebook that can run from top to bottom, from top to bottom without errors. And you can always do this. If you want to double check if your code works, you can run your code from top to bottom using this button here. If you hit restart and run all, it will clear everything and run all the cells in your notebook. So here I can try restart, run all. Notice that the numbering starts over. You see that it numbers, these numbers are in order in which they're executed, right? So, oh, I can see I broke my code. I can go fix it and then try running it from top to bottom again. Restart and run all. Now, the other thing to remember is that a Jupyter notebook, what's displayed is one thing, right? You have the stuff in the cells and you have the outputs. That's always going to be there. Even if you close your notebook and you reopen your notebook, all of that will be there, but everything that's underneath the hood won't. Remember that the fact that x equals 10, if I close that notebook, it's going to forget that. It's going to erase all of that memory, I suppose you could say, of what was done. So right now, I know that x equals 10, and I can double check that. I can print x to the screen. But if I close this notebook, see if let's save it first. If I close the notebook, and then I reopen it, I may shoot myself in the foot. It may actually remember. Let's see if it remembers x. If I try doing something with that, it still remembers it. As long as your session is still active, it will remember these variables. But as soon as you shut down your notebook, let's say that I quit Python and reopen it, then it will not remember that x equals 10 anymore, just to demonstrate. If I go out here, I can actually shut a notebook down myself while still having Anaconda open. If I do this, I can shut down my notebook. And now when I open this notebook, all of the memory has been erased. So the code is still there, right? It's still x printed 10 here. But if I go and try to continue my work, it says x is not defined. It has forgotten that. So you have to remember that. Keep that in mind while you're doing this. As long as you keep that, as you're aware of that, then hopefully things won't be confusing. You may have had this problem before where you wanted to pick up your work after you did part of your homework assignment and you were a little confused when you couldn't pick up where you left off. This is why. So just make sure that you internalize that. There is one little help that may come in handy. I don't use this a lot because I'm just constantly aware that whenever I open a notebook, I need to redefine my variables. There's this little magic command. Anything that starts with a percent sign is known as a magic command. And I think it's who. This will list all of the variables that are currently stored in memory. And right now it's empty. But if I define x and then define y, if I run this little variable, it will tell me, oh, whose is the one. Sorry, whose will actually give me not just the variable, but also what it's saved as right now. So that's kind of a little tool, handy little tool. Again, I don't use it all the time, but it could be something maybe that you would like to incorporate into your workflow to help you out when you're doing statistical calculations. So that will give you a nice list of all of the variables that are currently stored in memory. Okay, so that's hopefully one little blip of useful information when working with Python in Jupyter Notebook.